What kind of wheat are we talking about when we talk about making our good whole wheat sandwich bread? Well, I like to mix a couple of types of wheat when I make my breads. I start out with the hard red wheat. If you have had a loaf of whole wheat bread that's been very dense, very heavy, it was probably made from 100% hard red wheat. Now, I don't particularly care for that really dense texture, although the flavor is great, but the texture is a little dense. I'm doing a 50-50 blend between a hard red wheat and a hard white wheat. Now, the hard white wheat is also a winter wheat. It's just a different variety, a little less protein, not a whole lot less, a little less bran, but the mix between the two just will lighten up your bread. So when you go out to buy your whole wheat, buy some hard red wheat and some hard white wheat. You want to not get the pastry kind of wheat, which is a soft white wheat. That's a little too light. It will lighten up your bread, and you can add it to your hard red wheat or your hard white wheat, and it will give a pretty good product. But I like to keep the protein up and the fiber up by using the hard types of wheat, the white and the red. Whole wheat, because it still has all of its bran and oils and all that natural goodness in it, it tends to go rancid more quickly than your white bleached or white processed flours. So you don't know how long it's been sitting on the shelf down at the grocery store. I recommend getting your flours at a good source, a place that you know has a high turnover of their flours, especially if you buy them in bulk bins, which is a great way to buy your flours. But if they've been sitting there, you need to make sure that there's a high turnover. If you go to a health food store that's not frequented by people that are buying that kind of stuff, you'll probably want to go to a pre-ground flour that a lot of the health food stores keep in the refrigerator section, and that's excellent if you can find it in the refrigerator section, because it means that they are taking the care to keep those vitamins and nutrients as fresh as possible. I like to measure out about 400 grams of each kind of wheat, of the red wheat and of the white wheat. And I just use my scale. It comes out to be about 3 cups of each kind of flour. So 400 grams is roughly about 3 cups of flour. So that's what I have in this bowl here. I've just measured together my hard red wheat and my hard white wheat. And I've also added about a 1/4 cup of oat flour. Oats are a really good source of fiber. Not like there's a lack of fiber in the other wheats that we're using, but just one more punch of fiber, it's always a good thing. Alright, so I have the 3 kinds of flours in here, and I've mixed them together. So we start with the flour in one mixing bowl, and then in the larger mixing bowl we're going to add about 1.5 cups of hot water. And this can be hot tap water. You want it pretty hot. So you want around about 110, 115 degrees is a really good temperature for your water. And I'm just going to go get it out of the tap. Alright, so I have my 1.5 cups of hot tap water that I'm putting in my big measuring bowl. Now, most of the time when I make my bread, I do use a big heavy-duty mixer, but a lot of people say, oh, well, that's why your bread turns out so good, it's because you have that mixer. I want to show you that you can mix a good loaf of bread by hand, so that's what I'm going to use today. Alright, we have our hot water in here. Now, to this hot water I am going to add some sweetener. And you can use lots of different kinds of sweeteners. The typical kind of sweetener that we use in a whole wheat bread is honey. Today I'm going to use brown rice syrup because that's what I have up in my cupboard. I do also have honey, I have agave syrup, I have just regular sugar, but I want to use this up. I haven't used it for a little while, and I want to use it today as my sweetener. So I'm going to add about 1/4 cup to my mixture, to my hot water in here, and get things going. And I don't really, I've been making bread so long, I can kind of eyeball it, but you'll probably want to measure out 1/4 cup of sweetener. You can use white table sugar, that's okay, but I figure we're doing such a good job at keeping all of that stuff out of our bread with using our freshly ground wheat, that why add processed refined sugar to something that's so good. All right, I'm also going to add this mixture that I've made, and you're probably saying, what is that? Well, you need an oil of some sort in your bread to keep it moist, to keep it from drying out, not only during the baking process, but just as it sits on your counter. So you can use a 1/4 cup of oil, and I recommend using like a safflower oil. You can use a canola oil, but I like to use flax meal instead of oil for a couple of reasons. One, it's adding a whole lot of fiber. Again, more fiber. Can't have too much fiber is what I say. And it also adds a lot of omega-3s. Flax meal, which is just ground up flax seeds, is the highest source of omega-3 in the plant kingdom. The only other way that you can really get higher flax is to go to your fish oils. So this is a great way to get some omega-3s, and it's an oil, so we're getting some of that fat in there as well. So I'm just going to, what I've done here is I've added a 1/4 cup of flaxseed meal, the ground flax seeds, to a cup of hot water. And I've let it sit here for about 15 minutes, and it's just gotten to be rather gelatinous and kind of gummy, and that's how it will turn. And you just add that right to your water and sweetener mixture in your bowl. And like I said, you can use regular oil for this, but I like to add the flaxseed. Alright, so we're just going to give that a stir. Now at this time I just go back and use my dirty flaxseed container. I'm going to put about a 1/4 cup of hot water in this. And to that I am going to add about a tablespoon of instant yeast. You don't have to use as much of the instant yeast as you'd use active dry yeast. If you have active dry yeast on hand and not instant, you probably want to almost double the amount of active dry from the instant kind of yeast. So I'm going to use about a tablespoon. You could use maybe 5 teaspoons of the active dry yeast and see how that works for you. It should be pretty good. Alright, I am just going to go get my measuring spoon. A tablespoon. And one of the problems that you can have with your yeast is if you've had it sitting in your refrigerator or freezer for a really long time, it might not be active anymore. It might not be good. And you'll be able to tell right away after you've stirred this around for a little bit, kind of dissolve it in the water. If you let it sit here for just a couple of minutes, and if it doesn't change, we have a big rainstorm going on right now. If it doesn't foam up and get really foamy and frothy, throw it out and go get you some good yeast. Because that means that your bread is not going to be successful. If your yeast is not good, your bread will not be good. Alright, so all you have to do is just stir that around. You can get a jump start on this by putting a little bit of sweetener in that. I can put a little bit of this rice syrup in there. You can put just some, which the lid is really on there now. Or you can put a little bit of sugar just to kind of give it a boost. We're talking about a teaspoon in there. That's all. Just give it a swoosh, put it around. Alright, we're going to wait for the yeast to get a little bit foamy. But while we're waiting for that, we're going to add we're going to add salt to our liquid. Now salt's a really important ingredient. If you leave salt out of anything that you bake, you're going to notice that your bread or any of your baked goods is going to be very flat tasting, just not very good. So we want to make sure that you get your salt in there. And I'm going to put 2 teaspoons of salt in this recipe. Salt also tempers the yeast action. If the yeast gets out of control, it can get very airy and your bread can get very coarse and open textured and not very good for making sandwiches. It will kind of fall apart. So if your bread turns out that way, you want to maybe cut down on your yeast, cut down on the rising time, add a little bit more flour. There's a few things that you can do to try to fix that. Alright, so we have our water in here, our sweetener, our oil or flaxseed mixture, our salt. Now we're going to start adding flour. Don't add the yeast yet. Flour goes first. And you've already measured out your flour, and this amount of liquid should take all of this flour that we've weighed out or measured out. So I'm going to put about 2 cups of flour and stir it around. And you're just getting that flour worked in. You're going to make a really wet batter out of it, kind of like a pancake batter. Alright, I'm going to add a little more flour, so this will be about half of our flour. You want to make sure you use a good big bowl. If it has a little handle on it, it really makes it nice for stirring. Alright, so here's how we have our batter so far. Okay, about half of our flour in there. And at this point we are going to add the yeast. Alright, just put your yeast in here. Get it all out. Alright, stir in your yeast. Everything should be pretty warm. Nothing should be cold when you're working with yeast. Alright, now we're going to start adding the rest of our flour. And it's going to start getting really difficult to stir. You just want to stir enough flour in to make a really soft dough, because then we're going to knead in the remaining flour. You get a really good workout this way. You know, people that make their bread have good strong arms. Well, if they make it in the old-fashioned way in the bowl anyway. Alright, so here's the consistency we have of the dough. See, it's very wet. Needs quite a bit more flour. We may have to add more flour. Like I said, we're having a rainstorm right now, so it's kind of wet outside. So I may have to add more flour than what I initially started with. Alright, now you want to get a good clean surface, hard surface, that you can knead this bread on. And I've cleaned this counter off and it's all ready to go. I do have a granite countertop. You don't have to have anything fancy. You can use a big cutting board. You can use a mat of some sort if you have that. But I'm just going to turn it right out. We're going to put some flour. Put some more of your measured flour. Just put it out on a pile. I'm going to put the whole thing out on a pile. And get started on working that flour in. So I have a pile of flour on my counter. I'm turning that wet dough out right into the middle of that pile of flour. Alright, try to get as much of the dough out of your bowl as you can. Alright, I can tell that I'm going to need some more flour. So I'm going to put some more hard white wheat flour. I'm just going to sprinkle that over the top. I have about a cup. And I think I'm going to need that much, but I'm just going to start with half a cup. Alright, so how do we do this kneading? Let me make sure you can see. Kneading is just the process of working up the gluten in your flour. Gluten is that part of wheat, the protein of the wheat, that's gotten some bad publicity lately. Gluten is what gives bread that real elastic chewiness. Without it, you have pancakes, you have flat. If you've ever tried to make a bread product from a non-gluten flour, such as rice flour or garbanzo bean flour, or any of the flours, that potato flour, you can't get a good rise because there's no gluten for the yeast to work on, no stretchiness. Alright, so basically you just turn the dough and push with the heels of your hand. Just turn and feed in flour as you get stickiness. Okay, you really want to lean into it, really work up that dough. And we're going to do this for a good 5 minutes, at least a good 5 minutes, until this is really good and stretchy. So I'm going to do that. We'll come back and see how it looks. See you in about 5 minutes. Alright, I've been kneading this for about 5 minutes. Kneading, I feel it's kind of therapeutic. Gets me into my own thoughts. Alright, one of the things that I'm asked a lot when I teach bread making classes is, how do I know when I've kneaded enough? Or how do I know when I've added enough flour? Well, those two things come together at about the same time. When you have kneaded it long enough, your bread becomes very elastic feeling, and it will hold together. And if you take a piece of your dough and you kind of pull it away, if there's a good stretch to it, that means that you've worked up that gluten and gotten that elasticity that it needs in order to make a really nicely formed loaf of bread. Now, as far as the flour, see, my hands are getting a little sticky on it. Just a little bit sticky. Alright? You don't want to add so much flour that your hands don't stick to your dough anymore, because then you've gone overboard and you've added too much flour, and you're going to have a very dry, probably dense textured bread. One, when you slice it, it will get crumbly on your cutting board and will dry out really quickly. So you don't want to get too much flour in there. Now, you remember I added about a half a cup of extra flour, and I have probably a quarter cup still on my kneading board here, so we only needed a little bit. I like to have a little bit left because it's hard to work on a surface that doesn't have a little bit of flour on it. Alright, you can see how my hands aren't sticking to it so much that I have dough all over my hands. That's, of course, way too wet. But just a little bit of tackiness, a little bit of stickiness on my dough. If I kept working this, I would probably get to the point where I'd have to add more flour. But you want to just get it to the point where it's sticking to your hands. Now, if you're using a mixer, a heavy-duty mixer, and you do need a heavy-duty mixer for whole grain breads, a lightweight KitchenAid kind of bread dough hook, you'll probably burn your motor out if you try to knead it with that kind of appliance. The kind I have, it's heavy duty. It's a Bosch, and it's heavy duty, and it can really take a lot of dough. So here we have our dough. It's all kneaded. It's ready for its first rise. Now, where do we put it for rising? Well, we put it back in a bowl. You don't want to put it in an unoiled bowl. You want to make sure that you spray it or put some oil of some sort in there. I just give it a good spray with cooking spray. Just coat the sides and the bottom with the cooking spray. And I always put it, I kind of round it up So it's a nice ball. I just kind of take it and squeeze it together, shaping the top of it. I'm going to put the top down, then I'm going to flip it over. Okay. Alright, now if you have a lid for your mixing bowl, you want to put that on it. If you don't, cover it with plastic wrap. And on a day like this when there's no sun available, I'm going to put it underneath my stove light. It's a halogen light, it's nice and warm there, and it's going to probably take, for this first rise, again I live at high altitude, so it's going to rise quicker than if I lived at sea level. So my first rise is going to be about a half an hour to 45 minutes. At sea level, probably a good hour or longer. And you want it to double in size. So this is going to get all the way up to the top of this bowl, and when it's up to the top of the bowl, I know it's ready to be punched down and for the second rise. And we'll get to that point and I'll show you where to go from there. So see you in about 45 minutes to an hour.